Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Geary Institute for Public Policy Research Seminar. Today, our guest speaker is Dr. Robert Sweeney from TASC. Robert is the Senior Economic and Policy Analyst at TASC. He's currently the lead researcher on a project examining economic inequality in Ireland and Europe. His work focuses on inequality in Ireland and how Ireland compares to other small European open economies. So today, Rob will be presenting a seminar on understanding market inequality in Ireland. And as per usual, we will take questions through the Q&A format and we'll discuss matters at the end of the seminar. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Rob. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doran, and thank you to the Geary Institute for giving me this invite to speak on this topic. So the presentation I'm going to give it's pretty sort of general level of how do we understand market inequality in Ireland. And the format of the presentation, the things I'm going to talk about, delve on a few different issues related to this topic. I'm going to make some comments on market inequality and redistribution in Ireland. So Ireland does have a very redistributive welfare system, and I'll make some comments on how we might understand that and what implications that has for not only overall inequality, but also market inequality as well. I will make some comments on individual versus equivalized market inequality across countries. So equivalized is income after sharing between household members, essentially. And there is some important distinctions to be made between individual and equivalized income and market inequality. And the relationship isn't that strong across countries. Then I will talk about pay and income in Ireland. So following on from the previous point, someone is not necessarily income poor if they have low pay. So for instance, the classic example here would be a student from a middle-class background who has, working in the hospitality sector or what have you. They're not necessarily income poor because they get income support from their parents, even though they have a low-paid job. And I will look at this in Ireland, the relationship between pay and income in quite a bit of detail. Actually, the relationship is pretty strong. People who are low paid tend to be in the lower part of the income distribution. My point just made is that isn't necessarily the case, but it tends to be the case. And then I will look at the effects of employment expansion on market inequality. So that follows from some work I did, I guess it was just over a year ago now. It was released, over a year ago. One of the TASC reports, and I simulated how market inequality would change if we had an expansion in employment. So I understand that many of these concepts will be familiar to you anyway, but just in case some of them aren't. So labor income is essentially the income you get from your job. That's mostly employee income, but it's also self-employment income. And it could also be, it also includes in-kind income as well, where that could be something like a company car. Capital income is distinct from labor income. So capital income would be income you get if you own property and you rent it out. So if you're a landlord, you get rental income. That's a component of your capital income. It also incorporates income from financial assets as well. I don't think I need to say too much more about that. And then just to touch on this again, individual versus equivalized income. So individual income is the income that I or one gets themselves, whereas equivalized income is income that accrues to a person after household sharing. So for instance, if I don't have a job and my individual income is 0, but I live with one other person, say my spouse, and she earns, say, 50,000 euros, well then household income per person, which is basically what equivalized income is 25,000 euros then. So there's a distinction to be made between individual and equivalized income. So this chart will be familiar to many people. So what we see here is that, so first of all, it shows the Gini coefficient of equivalized inequality. The Gini coefficient is an index of inequality, 0 being perfect equality, where everybody earns the same, and 1 being perfect inequality, where one person gets all of the income. And we see that, just so I've just forgot to say something. So market income is basically the sum of your labor income and your capital income. So we see that the inequality in market income here by the bars. So this is at an equivalized level. So after there's sharing of resources between household members, we see that Ireland has the highest inequality among European countries of the OECD. 2018 data mostly. So this is quite well known, and essentially I want to understand why this is the case. What are the factors that impinge on this? But we see that actually, when you look at disposable income inequality, the points here, it's considerably lower than market inequality. So disposable income is income after transfers and taxes have been paid. So it's your market income plus your transfers, so social welfare primarily, and then minus taxes paid. And we see that there's a very big difference between market income and disposable income inequality. So Ireland is now around middle, actually a little bit below middle in terms of its disposable income inequality among European countries, but it has the highest market inequality. And we see that the gap between these two things is also very high in Ireland. So that means that the taxation and transfer system does a lot in Ireland to actually redistribute market income. So it has a very redistributive welfare state. So another point on redistribution, this is part of a project that I did on the care economy last year. Now, this was the latest data that I found last year, which unfortunately related to 2015. There might be some more up-to-date data. So this looks at spending on family and children in the European Union. Mostly is GDP. So this is Ireland as a percentage of GDP, but this is Ireland as a percentage of GNI star, the more relevant measure of national income. And we see that Ireland pays a lot out in terms of transfers, spending on family and children, and it's specifically focused on cash benefits. So it has a variety of programs that distribute cash benefits to families. So for instance, child benefit, but many others as well. And that it spends not so much on services. So for instance, a lot of other countries, Finland, France, Sweden, they spend a lot on services, and a lot of that would be childcare. So this is just adding substance to the claim that Ireland is a transfer-rich but service-poor welfare state. And that will have important implications, as we'll see. Now, this came from a report I did last year, the last inequality reports that I did with TASC, where I looked at the relationship between low pay and individual earnings inequality. So Eurofound the European Foundation for Living and Working Conditions. It has a metric which calculates inequality of labor income. Labor income in this sense is inequality of individual labor income. So it's the inequality of basically the sum of employee income, self-employment income, predominantly, mostly, and also in-kind benefits. So here, excuse me. So on the vertical axis here shows the ranking of a country among European Union countries in terms of how unequal it is. And here is the ranking in terms of the prevalence of low pay. So this is the Gini coefficient of individual labor income, and it's what's called full-time equivalent monthly income. So it's income, your monthly labor income, as if everybody was working full-time. So it's very similar, almost very similar to hourly earnings, essentially, although it also includes self-employment income. We see that Ireland has the third highest rate of low pay, according to these figures, and also it is the third most unequal in terms of distribution of individual labor earnings. And indeed, the relationship is almost linear. So there's a very strong relationship between the prevalence of low pay, which is not surprising because low pay is actually a relative income measure. It's the proportion of full-time workers who are earning less than 2/3 of the median in terms of gross earnings. So there's a very strong relationship here between low pay and individual earnings inequality. However, when you look at individual earnings, or now I'm looking at low pay and indeed high pay, but let's just look at low pay for a minute here. When you look at the relationship between low pay and equivalised market inequality, so equivalised is after household earnings are shared. The relationship is pretty weak. In fact, it's negative, which is surprising. So there isn't a strong relationship at all between individual earnings inequality when using low pay and kind of what tends to be the more widely used measure of market inequality, and that's equivalised market inequality. It's scattered all over the place. I mean, one reason why that might be the case is that maybe in some countries it is primarily younger people, students who do the low pay work. Maybe in other countries it's actually low income people who do low paid work, but there's variation among countries. Again, this is OECD European countries. However, when you look at high pay, the incidence or prevalence of high pay and equivalised market inequality, there is definitely a stronger relationship there. So in case you're wondering, high pay is the share of workers earning more than 1.5 times the median earnings. So there is a stronger relationship. It's maybe not as strong as you'd expect, because if you actually zoom in, obviously a little bit, spread is actually wider. But that's interesting. When measured with low pay, it's not a strong relationship, but with high pay, it becomes stronger. So there are many ways to measure inequality. I mentioned the Gini coefficient already, and here I've plotted the Gini coefficient with the Palma ratio. So the Gini coefficient is on the vertical axis. The Palma ratio is on the horizontal axis. So the Palma ratio is the ratio of the income of the top 10% to the bottom 40%. And as with a lot of the various, and this is equivalised disposable income. As with a lot of the inequality metrics, you can pick and choose between them, and there's a strong relationship here in this case, because they're both looking at equivalized disposable income. In fact, it's almost linear, and we see Ireland here actually when you use the latest data. Ireland is now, it's in the middle, but actually one of the more equal countries now in disposable income terms. But still, we have very high labor market, very high market inequality. So again, this is just elaborating a little bit on the PAMA ratio. So one of the reasons why PAMA ratio is interesting is because the insight by PAMA was that basically when you look at different countries, inequality is mostly driven by gains of the top 10% at the expense of the bottom 40%, is his argument. And actually the share of the income going to the middle group, i.e. below the top 10% and above the bottom 40%, is actually it's fairly constant across countries. There's not much variation. So we see here the countries are aligned according to the income share of the of the bottom 40%. This is a little bit dated. This is 2016. Ireland would be a bit more equal now. But what I want to draw your attention to is the share of income going to the going to this middle group, beg your pardon. So Bulgaria is actually the most unequal country, and Czech Republic is the most equal country when measured by the share of income going to the bottom 40%. However, there isn't much difference in the share going to the middle groups in these countries. And in fact, there isn't a very clear pattern at all, despite the fact that these are aligned according to the income of the bottom 40%. And indeed, actually, in some work that PAMA did for us at TASC, he also compared Sweden and Uruguay, i.e. a Latin American country. And indeed, the share of income going to this middle group didn't vary much, even when you compare highly unequal Latin American countries and Sweden. So the conclusion that he drew from this is that in order to understand inequality, you need to view it in terms of a battle, so to speak, between the top 10% and the bottom 40%. Now, I think he overstates his case a little bit, but I think it is a very useful insight. Okay, again, this was from an inequality report a couple of years ago. So in order to delve into this a bit more deeply, I looked at Ireland and looked at how Ireland compared to the 5 most equal European countries and also the European average. So this is the bottom 40% in equivalized disposable income. So what we saw here, I think this is 2016 data, that the bottom 10% in Ireland doesn't do too poorly at all. I mean, not that it does well, but relative to other countries, it's not doing too bad. So the bottom decile got a lot more than the European average, despite the fact that it was in the middle during this time. But where Ireland lagged behind the more equal countries of the European Union was the share of income going to those groups who are just above the poorest of the poor. It's not so much the poorest of the poor. And that speaks to the work that the transfer system in particular in Ireland does to redistribute market inequality, because you'd have to think that a lot of these people here are not in employment, and probably the second decile as well. This looked at the top 10%. Not as striking as the previous figure. What we see is Ireland is quite like the EU average, in that similar share going to the top 1%, although the share of income similar share of income going to the top 10% when you compare it to the EU average. Although the share of income going to the top 1%, again similar to the EU average, but it's much higher than the more equal countries of the European Union. So in order to understand that a little bit further, what I did actually in the last few days, I looked at where I'm actually I'm missing a slide, an important slide. Hang on, if you just bear with me. Okay. No, I won't be able to retrieve it. I had a slide showing that I was looking at the composition of income of the bottom deciles of the income distribution. And what I showed was that the bottom deciles of the income distribution are very reliant on the transfer system. So if you look at the bottom decile in Ireland, it gets about 25% of its gross income is from the market, and the remaining 65% is from transfers. The second decile was almost identical, so about a quarter of its income was from the market, and again about 75% of its income was from transfers. Then the third decile had a bit more income from the market. About a third of its income was from the market, and about 2/3 was from transfers. And then when you looked at the fourth decile, it was, if I recall, almost about 40, almost half, a little bit less than half of its income was market income, and then a little bit over half of it was in transfers, and this is equivalized income. And then I also looked at the top 10%, the breakdown of its income, and the top 10% got 85% of its income from the market, and 15% of its income was in transfers. So for the top 10% in particular, it got most of its income from the market. I didn't break this down according to the components of market income, but it was it's pretty good bet that most of this is from the labor market. So that's an interesting finding because it suggests that if you redistribute market income and have a more egalitarian distribution of wages, especially if it redistributes from the top decile, that you will create a more market equal country. So what I then did was, so the bottom quintile, they get about 25% of their gross income, equivalized gross income from the market, and that is primarily from the labor market. But I also looked at where this bottom quintile in equivalized income terms, where they are in the pay distribution. So here, when I talk about pay distribution, this is the full-time equivalent individual earnings. So what this means that among people in the bottom quintile who receive individual labor income, just over 35% of those are in the bottom decile of individual earnings, basically. I'll say that again. So this is the bottom quintile in terms of equivalized disposable income. And among the bottom quintile who are actually getting labor income, most of them are actually in the bottom decile of individual labor income. And this is full-time equivalent labor income, like I was talking about previously. And what we see is that they're also fairly prominent in the second and third deciles, fourth deciles less so, and it gradually goes to almost none, basically, at least in the EU Silk microdata. None are in the top decile. If we look at the second quintile, most of those who are receiving labor income in the second quintile, most of them are in the second decile in terms of individual labor income. And it's a little bit more spread than obviously the first quintile. Now, of course, labor income and market income in general doesn't account for a huge portion of their income. It's only about a quarter of their income. Nevertheless, among those who do work, it is they're mostly located in the bottom part of the pay distribution. Hope that's clear. When we look at the top decile, this is the top decile in equivalized disposable income, and we're looking at where they are in the pay distribution. So the top decile get about 85% of their gross income from the market, and that's going to be mostly from the labor market. And we see that people in the top decile, among those who actually receive labor income, they're mostly in the upper echelons of the pay distribution. So we see that a little over a third of them are in the top decile, about a fifth of them are in the 9th decile, and about 12–13% are in the 8th decile, and so on. Now, this would suggest strongly that if you wanted to redistribute market income, equivalize market income, that wage redistribution of pay from the top decile to whoever would be redistributed. Less so for less so for just say increasing the pay or the wages of those in the bottom part of the distribution. Not that poor people aren't in low-paid jobs, but more so that it doesn't comprise a huge part of their income. They're quite transfer dependent. So this is just a heat map of some of the points that I've been making. So here this shows equivalized disposable income, and this is what decile they are, and this is individual pay or labor income decile. So what this is saying is that when we look at the bottom decile in disposable income terms, about 49% of them are in the bottom decile of the individual pay bracket, 18% in the second decile pay, and so on. So it's just basically summarizing the points that I've already made. So again, redistribution, high income would reduce market inequality, and this is consistent with the cross-country graph that I presented earlier, which show the relationship between individual high pay incidence and equivalized market inequality. Okay, so there's another important component of market inequality, and it is fairly well known, at least among researchers, that Ireland has high levels of so-called jobless households. This is households where nobody in the house has a job, and it refers to 18 to 59-year-olds mostly. So if we look at this, so Ireland is the it is the 8th highest in terms of the prevalence of jobless households in 2019. So a little over 8% of households in Ireland have nobody working. This is households with 18 to 59-year-olds. It's excluding students and retired people. And it's changed a little bit since 2016. We were the 7th highest, so it has fallen a little bit since 2017. But if you actually look at children in jobless households, we're among the highest. So we're the 3rd highest in Europe. Now, we can't see children in Ireland. So children is the open points here. It's actually covered by the 2016 data, unfortunately. But when you look at children in jobless households, we're actually the third highest in the European Union. And so this is often said to be also a driver of Ireland's high levels of market inequality. And so I also investigated this that in the report that was released just over a year ago. My motivation for doing so was to find out, is this an important driver of market inequality? I should say that I'm not saying that we need to put more people, low-paid people, into work. And there is a narrative among government and others that, you know, if we just look at joblessness and so on, that will solve market inequality. So my motivation here was to, well, see if this is really the case. And a related issue to jobless households is the proportion of people in households with zero market income. So this isn't just 0 to 59-year-olds. It could be any households. And looking at the EU Silk microdata for EU Silk 2017, what I found was that 21% of Irish working age adults have no market income, compared to an EU average of just 12%. So we do have many adults who have zero market income, much higher than the European average. And if we look at the composition of these people, it's somewhat more women than men. So a little over half are women, and mostly they're low education groups, essentially. So what I did in that report was I tried to simulate what would be the effect of expanding employment among these groups. So what would happen if we gave these people some market income? So here in this graph, this is the Gini coefficient of equivalized labor income. So it's different to the previous ones. It's not quite market income, but it is equivalized, and it's labor income. And here is Ireland, and I simulated the effects of employment expansion among these groups. So I'll just tell you how I did that. So what I did was, so one question that arises, so 21% of adults don't have market income, and I gave some of those adults market income. So I said, what would be the impact of having only 12% instead of 21% of individuals with no market income? That is, we give a little over half of the population without market income, we give them market income. So we move Ireland to the European norm, essentially. One question that arises is how much market income to give these new entrants into the market. A natural possibility is to give them the average income of their corresponding or incumbent group who currently have market income. So for instance, 8% of the population with no market income is medium educated males. So we could give 8% of the new entrants into the labor market. We could give them the average individual labor income of medium educated males. So that's essentially the approach that I took. Is I looked at the composition of adults with zero market income in terms of education and age, and I gave them the average earnings of those who had jobs. So basically 8% of zero market income adults are medium educated males. I simulated what the effects would be of giving them the average earnings of medium educated males. I broke this down according to education and age group. And in one of my simulations, I gave a little penalty, especially for older groups. So for instance, it's probably a pretty big assumption that, say, a 50-year-old or 55-year-old who's been unemployed for a prolonged period of time, that they would actually get the average earnings of a 55-year-old of similar education, because there's obviously going to be a penalty for lost experience. And so this one here looks at a penalty for lost experience based on age. So what I did was, so a 45, I won't go into it too much more because it's a little bit involved. So what were the effects of bringing Ireland to EU level average in terms of individuals with zero market income? Well, we saw that Ireland goes from among the most unequal in terms of equivalized labour market inequality, and it moves towards the middle, maybe a little bit above the middle. So there is significant reduction in inequality when you actually expand employment among these groups. Now, obviously, market inequality and labour market inequality are labour market income inequality are not quite the same thing, because labour income is only one component of market income. And here I repeated the exercise of the previous figure, but I looked at what would be the effects of giving them the average market income of their cohorts with market income. So basically, this figure repeats the exercise of the previous figure, but instead allocates the new entrants on the basis of market income instead of labor income. So for instance, if 8% of individuals without market income were low educated males in their 50s, 8% of the new entrants were given the market income of that cohort, the average market income of that cohort. This is essentially on an individualized basis, and then I divided by household size. And what we see here when we give the people outside of the market the average market income of their cohorts without market income, again, this is the penalty for lost experience. Ireland does move towards the middle, but there is still significant inequality. So we're still a little bit above the middle here. So expanding employment would reduce market inequality, but there's still a significant amount of market inequality here. So it's not just a matter of joblessness. And indeed, that's obviously consistent with the points I made in the first half of the presentation, that there's a strong relationship between the incidence of high pay on an individual basis and the prevalence and the level of equivalized market inequality. Okay, so some of the conclusions, and I'll try to find the important slide that I didn't actually include. So some of the conclusions that I would draw from the analysis is that the relationship between individual earnings and equivalized market inequality is mixed. So the relationship between low pay, which is one measure of individual earnings inequality, and market equivalized market inequality is not very strong at all. Surprisingly weak. In fact, it's basically in the opposite direction that we would expect, very surprisingly. However, the relationship, recall, between high pay and equivalized market inequality was indeed stronger. And an implication from that in an Irish context especially is that higher pay at the bottom, so if we just say improved, went towards a living wage, that would reduce market inequality in Ireland, but all else equal, it would only modestly reduce market inequality. The reason being is that those people who would most benefit from, say, the living wage is they only get a small share of their income from the market. So if we really wanted to increase their market income, and it's an open question because a lot of those people have carrying responsibilities and whatnot. If we really wanted to increase their income, what you would do is you would expand employment, and the biggest impediment to employment among lower income households, by far the biggest, is childcare expenses. So if you really wanted to improve the pay at the bottom, what you would have is measures that would improve their pay, such as the living wage, collective bargaining, and so on, plus also investment in public services. So it would be a combination of wage measures and investing in services, so as that it actually is economically sensible to actually take up employment. Because, as I mentioned, childcare costs are a huge impediment to actually taking up employment. So the third point here is that if you reduced earnings at the top, it would strongly impact market inequality. So those at the top of the distribution get about 85% of their gross income from the market on an equivalized basis. So things such as CEO pay, tackling pay in professional services such as the legal profession, things like that, bonuses among executives, that would go a long way to reducing market inequality in Ireland and elsewhere. And then employment expansion would also move Ireland towards the middle in market inequality. So thank you.